Welcome, everyone. I hope you're safe and well in this difficult time. Thank you for joining us today for this event. My name is Safa Louakili. I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society, and I'm also a master of environmental management here at Oxford. Our society is part of the Oxford University, and we aim to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. Apart from our speaker events, we organize educational programs throughout the year, including our School of Climate Change. And we run the world's largest student-led climate journal, The Anthroposphere. We're also working with the university to integrate climate into the Oxford curriculum. So today's event will address the impact of climate change on food security. That is to say, its impact on people's ability to access sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. While food systems go beyond the sole production stage and encompass all the activities linked to processing, retailing, and consuming, for example, we will focus today more on the challenges to the agricultural production and the techniques that are implemented and that we can implement to build resilient systems. So since 2014, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has registered an increase in undernourishment in the world. And that is a striking turn from the decreasing trend of the last 50 years. So in 2019, about a quarter of the world population faced moderate to severe levels of food insecurity, with the most rapid increase in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. And this increase was mostly, according to the FAO, tied with the outbreak of conflicts and economic shocks. But another threat is on everyone's mind, and that is climate change. The increasing climate risk, including irregular rainfall or prolonged droughts, have already affected the food production, pest infestations, or the spread of disease. And so these particularly affect small-scale farmers that tend to not have the financial or technical ability to invest in advanced irrigation systems, drought-resistant seeds, or synthetic fertilizers, or others who have to reckon with decades of intensive and unsustainable agricultural practices and their legacy, including soil degradation, water salinity, and biodiversity loss, to cite a few. And so today we'll address a number of questions around this kind of dilemma and seeming injustice, namely, so how to support these farmers and their community, which rely on their yields, what technology can be implemented to build resilient agricultural systems, and what are the alternative approaches to intensive and external inputs dependent agriculture and sustainable agriculture. So to discuss these questions, I am delighted to welcome Professor Timothy Lassalle and Dr. Zitouni Wuldeda. Among many of his credentials, Professor Lassalle is Professor Emeritus of California Polytechnic State University, where he co-founded the Center for Regenerative Agriculture. He also served as the first CEO of Rodale Institute and Executive Director of the Alan Savory Center for Holistic Management, where he worked respectively on organic agricultural research and holistic plant grazing. And Dr. Wuldeda is currently a Deputy Director in the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Before joining the FAO, he worked as Head of Technology Unit at the UN Environment Programme. And prior to that, he worked for the British government in senior positions in various agencies, including the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And so we're going to start with each of the speakers giving a short speech on their thoughts, with their thoughts on the topic, and then that will be followed by questions from me, and then we will open it up to you, the audience. And so if you have any questions, please leave them in the live stream chat, and I'll make sure to address them to the speakers. And so to start, I'll hand over to Dr. Wuldeda, if you may.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Safa. Thanks very much for this kind invitation, and welcome everyone who's joining us online. It's my pleasure to kick off this event. And I will start with looking at the big picture on climate change and food security, and then give some figures on where we are with hunger today around the world and what are the key drivers. And to talk about other challenges, particularly facing the global south, in addition to climate change, that are affecting food security. And then to finish with some examples of some solutions that are available today in tackling both climate change and food security, and also highlight some of the big events that are happening next year, who are trying also to address these challenges we're facing and find some solutions. So this is what I will be talking about in the slides that I will be showing shortly. And I look forward to any discussions or questions or comments that colleagues who are joining us may have. So we're really facing a number of challenges, obviously, today. In addition to climate change, we have the COVID pandemic, we have loss of diversity, we have a growing population, social unrest. There are various challenges really that are affecting our way of life and particularly in terms of food security. Few years back, particularly in 2015, leaders around the world agreed to address the danger of climate change, and they've agreed the Paris Agreement. They signed the Paris Agreement, and the goal of that is very clear. It's basically we reach a stage where we need to do something to avoid the danger of climate change. And the target is very clear. We need to make sure that we keep global average temperatures below 2 degrees C, but to make all the efforts we can to keep them actually below 1.5 degrees C. And this is the global objective that everyone is working towards, not just government, but also non-state actors that are working to help achieve the 1.5 degree goal and avoid dangerous climate change. But as you know, climate change also is an issue that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been looking at for years, trying to provide the evidence needed for policymakers to see what is the status of the climate now and what we need to do to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement that I mentioned. And they found that really to reach that goal, it's very challenging. We need to make huge changes to our way of lives, and all the sectors of the economy have to contribute. And basically, we need to make really drastic reductions to greenhouse gas emissions. We need to use all the technologies that are available to us. And we also need to change our behavior, our way of life in terms of how we use natural resources to make sure that we use them in an efficient and sustainable way. And obviously, we need investment in all the low carbon options that are available to us. The climate goal also fits in as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 13, which is about climate action. And here, when we look at the progress that we're making, unfortunately, we have 10 years left really to reach these goals and to transform our world, basically. But unfortunately, the progress we're making is not enough. I mean, the actions we're taking is not advancing at the scale and the speed that we need to deliver these goals. So we need to accelerate solutions really to meet these goals. And if we zoom in into the food system, there are so many challenges facing the food system. Basically, the food system at the moment uses so much resources in an efficient way. Agriculture in particular occupies 40% of the land around the world, and it contributes to about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, and it uses 70% of fresh water. And in addition to that, 80% of the agricultural land used is just for livestock feed. And when you look at the fish stocks around the world, more than a third of the fish stock is of fish. So there is a problem here. And when we consider that we have a growing population that we need to feed, then we can't continue in this particular way. The food system is broken, basically, and we need to fix it. The IPCC also looked at the relationship between climate change and land, and they found really some useful facts there with regard to how we use land and what impact it has on climate change. And basically the way we produce our food and the choice we make in our diet have an important impact on land, and also on greenhouse gas emissions, and hence on climate change. So the land that we're already using, when we look at feeding a growing population, we don't actually need deforestation. Obviously, we don't need to cut any more trees. We have enough food to feed everyone, and we have enough land, the current land available, to grow food efficiently and sustainably, to feed everyone. So what we need to do is to manage this land better. And if we do that, we can also contribute to conserving biodiversity as well. So unfortunately, when we look at all these aspects and see what's happening with access to food and availability of food, hunger is on the rise. There are almost 700 million around the world that go hungry, and about 2 billion people who don't have regular access to safe and nutritious food. Basically, the situation we have is, on one hand, we have around 700 million people who go hungry, and on the other hand, we have around 2 billion people who are obese or overweight. So it doesn't really make sense, and this has to be fixed. And if this trend continues, obviously, we're not going to meet the SDG 2, which is about achieving zero hunger. And when we look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we estimate that COVID-19 could add between 83 and 132 million people to the total number that we have of undernourished people around the world by the end of this year. So, the COVID-19 is making the situation even more difficult, because we know that the most vulnerable communities are the ones that suffer most from these pandemics and shocks, including climate change. So in addition to climate change, as I mentioned in my introduction, there are other challenges, other disasters that are facing countries in the South, and in particular the desert locust is really having a big impact here on countries, as you see in the map there, particularly Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Yemen. And there is really an important widespread of breeding that is continuing, particularly in Ethiopia and Somalia. And it's expected that there will be swarms, forming in early December that could really move into other countries, particularly Kenya and Somalia. So it's really a serious problem that we shouldn't underestimate, even though we talk about COVID-19, but there are other problems also that countries are suffering from and are affecting food security. In addition to that, the fall armyworm is also another problem facing countries of the South, as you can see in the map there. And the spread is rapidly happening around Africa, the Near East, Asia, but also the Pacific. And this is not something to be neglected, because we're talking about something like 18 million tons of maize that is lost every year in Africa, for instance. And this is enough to feed, obviously, millions of people. And when we look at the economic loss, we're talking about something like $4.6 billion that is caused by the fall armyworm. In addition to this, obviously, we have the issue of migration. And when we talk about plans and strategies and policies for climate change, we need to integrate migration into this as well. Why? Because if you look at the trends and the figures, we expect the number of international migrants to exceed 400 million by 2050. And we'll look at the impacts of climate risk here in particular, looking at drought and floods and sea level rise. They are among the causes of migration, particularly from rural areas. In developing countries in particular, if you look at the the loss and damage, where agricultural sector absorbs around 26% of the total damage and loss from climate-related disasters. This is the map here is showing something really new. Actually, is a report by FAO and WFP that just been published now, and looking at the current situation in about 20 countries there, and trying to raise an early warning in these countries on what might happen in the next 3 to 6 months. And the projections you can see there, they're based on the multiplicity of interlinked drivers. As you can see there in the map, we have tropical cyclones, locust, conflict, insecurity, flood, displacement, dry conditions, and economic crisis. And here, basically, we're looking at the situation. If this worsens, then food insecurity could lead to a risk of famine, particularly in countries such as Yemen, South Sudan, northeastern Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. So this is the really various factors that are affecting food security. If we look at the damage and loss, particularly in the 10 years between 2006 and 2016, you can see there the various disasters there, and climate-related disasters in particular, storms and floods and tsunamis and droughts. And you can see from the figure there, drought, storm, and floods in particular are the climate-related hazards that are causing the most damage and loss to the agricultural sectors. So in terms of solutions and what's available to us, what's available to the countries, and particularly support to farmers and smallholder farmers, I just want to start with some important aspects, particularly looking forward into the future of agriculture. Digital innovation obviously is important because it helps us to increase the productivity that we need to feed the growing population, but also the efficiency while preserving natural resources and protecting the environment. In terms of smallholder farmers, it will help them access information they need about the weather, about the growing season, etc., but also having access to markets and to help them increase their income and improve their livelihoods. And it's also an important to engage the youth and women and create jobs. And also technological innovation would help farming practices to be more resilient to the impact of climate change. And here I just want to mention one of the initiatives related to innovations, the FAO's hand-in-hand initiative, which allows developed and developing countries to support each other and share knowledge and expertise. And this is a country-led and country-owned initiative, and it's really aimed at accelerating the transformation of the food systems, particularly in rural areas, to eradicate poverty and hunger. And we have now a collaboration with Google, and we developed an Earth Map tool that is part of this hand-in-hand geospatial platform that allows the access to information and data. And in terms of solutions that are available to us from nature, if you like, these are nature-based solutions. So there's a combination of both what nature can provide and what innovation can provide. As I said earlier in the findings from the IPCC, we need to use all the means available to us if we want to reach really the 1.5 degrees C goal. And the nature-based solutions have a huge potential because they can protect and sustainably manage and restore degraded ecosystems. And they're also a key part of our global response to climate change and sustainable development. And they're a key part of building back better. And in terms of potential towards the goal, the Paris goal, and also to achieving mitigation by 2030, they can provide the third of the mitigation needed by then. So these are all important, and I just want to finish by mentioning two major events that are happening next year. The Food System Summit, obviously, that was called by the UN Secretary General, which will take place around September next year. And it is going to address some of the main issues that I highlighted here. There are 5 action tracks that will be addressed at the summits, starting from access to safe and nutritious food, to shifting our consumption patterns and towards sustainability, but also to enhance the nature positive production of food in an equitable way, and to build resilience to the shocks and stress such as climate change and pandemics, including COVID-19. And the other major event obviously happening next year is COP26, which will be held in Glasgow. And here again, some of the priorities is to raise ambition. As I mentioned earlier, we're not doing enough really. All the effort put together by all the countries, they don't take us far enough to reach the 1.5 degrees C, and we need to raise our ambition and action. And this also concerns non-state actors such as cities and regions, businesses and entrepreneurs. And when we look at the priorities, I just want to mention 2 in particular related to nature protection and adaptation and resilience. So I just want to finish by leaving you with the quote, I think, that sums up, the current situation, and particularly the fact that even though we have COVID-19, obviously, that is devastating, and it is being given a lot of attention in terms of the health impact, but also the environmental impact. Climate change is still here and is still continuing, and it's a long term, and we need to deal with it. And this is the quote I want to leave you with to finish. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that we need sustainable COVID-19 recovery plans that tackle climate change. So I'll stop it here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zitouni. It was a very interesting kind of presentation, introduction to all the challenges, but also opportunities that we have for tackling this issue. I will now let Tim do his presentation and present another perspective as well.
Are we ready to start here, Safa?
Oh, yes, sorry, please go on.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Thank you. Let me get this PowerPoint up. Thank you. And take it to the full place. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and with Dr. Ul Dada as well. I really appreciated his framing this discussion today, because I think the numbers and the data points that he has presented to us frames the questions as far as what should our actions be, how can we become more robust and more enthusiastic about trying to turn climate change around, and actually care for the questions and the challenges that hunger bring to us today. Is it fixable, and can we do it right away? Let me just say, in my experience over the course of many decades, it seems that as we followed conventional thinking and conventional tracks about agriculture or soil or food or climate, it left us on a fairly slow incline to make the kinds of increases needed to address these major concerns around the world. I had the opportunity to work with Howard Buffett in Africa, and with regard to that, in my research, I found that my fields were responding faster than what science said they could respond, because there was never enough nitrogen in the system to produce as much carbon as being produced. It made us come to start to wrestle with terms and getting away from organic terms, because often that degrades soil. Definitely getting away from conventional high input terms, because that degrades soil. And that's true in what's occurred with the African Green Revolution, which has sort of failed after 10 years, but we could have expected that because of the practices that are based in those systems. But we are working with, and now a number of people are working with, the ideas of regenerating. That is to turn into a collaboration with nature instead of working against her or trying to actually dominate nature. And it describes farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change, actually reverse it by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soils, the biodiversity improvement, and the carbon drawdown that is potential with this. And I'll show you some data points that encourage me to continue in this work and research. I want to say that while we look at climate change as an existential crisis, and Dr. Dada pointed out, we have about 10 years to really turn that piece around, and that's critical. We're also losing our soils at an extremely fast rate. In the upper left-hand corner of your screen is a field next door to the research fields I was working on in Africa and South Africa, and you see they're very sandy. But the weeds were growing very high on that next door field, and I asked the farm manager just to disc down the weeds. And then a rainstorm came, and look at how much erosion I created by just asking that field to be tilled. When I was doing some work with Howard Buffett in Burundi, the field in the upper right-hand corner looks like a very steep hill, and it is, but most all of Burundi is hilly, and it's all tilled. Every square inch is tilled, which means we're losing soil at extremely fast rates. In the lower right-hand corner is a field next to me here in California, just a couple of seasons ago. So much of this land is tilled because there's 10,000 years of experiencing of tilling fields to grow food. And it's a wrong approach. It's an approach actually that says we haven't learned our lessons. In the United States, we had the great dust storms and the Dust Bowl that occurred in the 30s. And we set up a whole government agency to deal with that. And look at, it's still happening. As a matter of fact, last year, my wife and I were in Rwanda presenting to a regional African conference. And somebody showed me a video of Tanzania dust storms that were as large, if not larger, than the ones pictured here. It's continuing around the world. A dear friend of mine, Roland Bunch, had said, and he published, a number of years ago, that there was a tragedy rushing at us towards starvation. And he said it was going to come in 4 to 5 years. He actually missed it by a few months with the great famine that had come, particularly in Western Africa a few years back. And it was due to not climate, not drought, as he would say. He said, I can't predict the weather. It was due to the fact that we've been degrading our soils. And what we mean by this is that as you pull and farm out through tillage or through chemical use fertilizers and destroy the organic matter in the soil, you have restricted and reduced its capacity to absorb and then hold the water. So a smallholder farmer said to him, is that how do we have a year where we have flash flooding and a drought? And this is how it happens. When you take that organic matter out of the soil, it will not percolate. The water won't percolate. It hits on the top and it runs away and you have a flash flood. And then the sun comes out, and since it didn't go down, it evaporates and you still continue with your drought. So focusing on the soil is a theme of my conversation. It's a theme because it begins to deal with issues of climate, which I'll show in just a few minutes. It deals with the issue literally of droughts, but also floods, which we could talk about. And it's a matter here of paying attention to this second existential crisis, which is facing us. And yes, this came out of, I think, FAO as well, Zuni, that it was saying we had 60 years left, and that was 5 years ago. And at the rate we're degrading and losing our soils, that's what's happening. On a project I was assisting Kofi Boa in Ghana on, where we were setting up experimental plots, and he was looking at no-till, he was looking at compost, he was looking at other ways of fertility. The treatment you see here in the cowpeas in the back part of that screen, where there was a successful crop, versus the cowpeas in the plot in the foreground of this screen, where there was failure to produce food to feed a family. There was only one treatment difference on these two plots, and that was tillage. The front plot was tilled, the back plot was not tilled in what ended up being a rain-short year. So soil structure matters in this. The actual organisms that then can come back into these soils matter in this because they create the glues that hold soil together. I show you two pictures of soil aggregation testing here that I was doing on my African soils on the right, and that very sandy soil you saw, my fields, are that center jar where the clod held together. The rain did not erode my field one bit, while the field next door, like in the jar on the left, it eroded, it washed away. The soils here on the left are my soils in California, the two that are still aggregated, holding together. Actually, I took this picture 10 days after I put it in that jar of water. It's still holding together, versus the very far left container where the soil completely melted away was my farmer friend across the road who discs his field every year. No aggregation, it erodes. You can't get penetration with water in it, and it's lost organic matter to hold water. I want to say that an ability to build the health of the soil, not only with more organic matter, holds more water. With the kinds of aggregation I showed you, it can begin to prevent floods. As a matter of fact, Gabe Brown, in some research he did on his farm, when he bought the farm, he got about 1/4 of an inch of percolation of rainfall per hour. But after he went to regenerative practices, he can get 11 inches per hour. And it's hard to find any storm, even in a climate stressed planet, that's going to drop 11 inches an hour. And so it begs the question, are flooding situations primarily the rain event or the soil structure? And it has to be a combination of those two. We can greatly reduce floods by changing the way we farm and treat our soils. But I'm going to jump. Really, I think that the challenge presented to us in the previous conversation here today is to say at our current rate, we're not going to fix these problems. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And it's why when I came back, I'd left the university over 30 years ago. I retired extremely early out of that to go into international work. And when I came back to California, leaving Africa, and I failed at retirement miserably, we co-created this Center for Regenerative Ag at Chico State, bringing David Johnson, who's also at New Mexico State, in with us because he's offered 3 primary paradigm changes with how we understand soil and its productivity, moving from a geochemical understanding to a living biological understanding. And what he's also shown is when we elevate soil from a bacterial dominant community to a fungal dominant community and bring in the quorum sensing and bring in the organisms that are nitrogen free associating organisms, where you don't even have to have a legume to capture the nitrogen, you can create self-fertilizing systems. If we look at a lot of our forest systems, they're already self-fertilizing. They don't need nitrogen. Can we get our agricultural systems there? Apparently so. We're showing it right now, and it's very, very encouraging because we know in manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer, we emit a lot of carbon dioxide. We know in applying it, we stimulate organisms that eat up the organic matter and respire CO2 to the atmosphere. So we have a chance to rethink our farming and turn this system into more affordable, more profitable, and more regenerating as far as the soil itself. The other thing, I'll show you some data points. Here's another paradigm change, because all the current research says, in general, when we do conservation ag and we do good practices, agroecological practices, we can capture 1/2 ton, maybe a ton of carbon per hectare per year. David's work in New Mexico has shown between 10 and 19 tons, and this has been sustained over 7 years. We are replicating these now in different sites as fast as we can because this is the most hopeful work we've seen. If it replicates even half that amount, it is where we could become very enthusiastic about making policy shifts and encouraging this biological system. What happens in crop productivity is we improve photosynthesis efficiency when we're working in collaboration with the organisms at the root zone, and we reduce the respiration of carbon to the atmosphere while increasing yields in general. This is just one example that David did this last year in the desert, where the soil had never been farmed and there's hardly any organic matter. He actually got a crop of sorghum versus a failed crop where no organisms were placed in the system. Some researchers in Belgium took the same design of Johnson-Su bioreactor, created the same organisms that anybody can do in their own backyard, and saw a doubling of their cover crop research. It is the same thing that's happening in Australia, where these farmers that are simply inoculating, no fertilizers, they're getting over twice the yields of their neighbor farms on barley in a low rainfall area. What you're also seeing here in green growing is a C4 grass, which is a perennial grass, not an annual grass. And it's a grass that had been missing from this ecosystem for 40 years. But just applying the biology reintroduced the biome that brought it back to life literally 40 years later. It was dormant in that soil. And they will graze this barley stubble with sheep, increasing the crop yield, fertility of the soils, and profit coming from those fields. All biology. What we're looking at is changing the way we're viewing things. And on the left is a normal root. If you pull a corn up and you see these white roots, to one where when you pull the roots out of the ground, you see what they like to call as sort of dreadlocks. I mean, it's where the root is emitting a tremendous amount of sugars and carbohydrates to feed the organisms, and the exchange takes place. The organisms work very hard to produce the nutrients or demineralize and free up the nutrients to bring it to the plant. Here's an example of what a root hair does when it feeds those organisms. It exudates all these sugars and all these carbohydrates so it can come into a system and a relationship with the organisms that will then turn around and feed it. It's the kind of thing that I didn't even know about this phenomenon a few years back, that the root hairs actually absorb and bring in, and in some cases digest these organisms, getting the nutrients. It also expels many of them to return them to the cycle so that they can go out in there being fed the sugars and bring together the proteins, bring together the nitrogen, bring together some of the minerals and vitamins that that plant may need. I show here, and I'm sorry I'm going through this very fast, but we're limited time, but here's a root hair, this blue root hair, with a couple of spores of mycorrhizae and their hypha actually reaching in and inserting themselves into the cell walls of that plant. What that fungi will do is it will transport water and it will transport nutrients, and it would demineralize, bound up phosphorus, and bring it to that plant. The plant will feed it, again, carbohydrates. You can extend the root sphere space in that soil by over 50 times when you have healthy biology and these mycorrhizae fungi. And what that means is in drought conditions, it's not just the water holding capacity of the soil, it's also the capacity of now these root hairs having a 50 times greater ability to reach out through the mycorrhizae, and they'll transport the water to the plant. They need the plant to survive and do well. The plant needs them to do the same. So these are important understandings of why Johnson's phases here of understanding we need a fungal dominant soil away from bacterial dominance builds a agriculturally based productive system that will also capture much more carbon. You see, weeds do very well on a high on a high bacterial soil. And that's where we find most of our ag soils. We've farmed the carbon and the organisms out, we've damaged the biome, and we have a lot of weeds. When you get high fungal, you drop that weed, and then you get a healthier system. This is a group of people building a bioreactor. There's a very large one just being now harvested and experiments going on in Kenya. We've had 61 countries connect with us, starting to be able to build their own and create their own inoculants to be able to look at what the fungal dominance can do within soils. It's very important that these bioreactors sit there over time. It's aerobic, it's non-turned. You end up with redworms in these systems to help break it down faster. But at 4 weeks, you have this number of species of organisms that kind of show up as the predominant ones. But after a year, when it's getting more mature, you have all of these species that come forward. We're creating a healthy biome, like when, as humans, we have a healthy gut biome, we have better moods and attitudes, we have better immunity. The same thing happens for plants. They have better immunity, they fight back disease and insects, as well as produce more nutrient-dense food. To accomplish this, we need to, as Dr. Christine Jones say, continue to increase the liquid carbon pathway through diversity. And I would say that to keep that diversity healthy in the soil, if we've inoculated it with the fungal dominance and all the bacteria and the other organisms that come, We can't have a single species crop year after year. And this is a field in Canada that had a rain short year. And on the left in the foreground is triticale, really a failed crop. There's not enough crop there to make the farmer meet their economic needs. But on the right, it was planted in a multi-species environment. And look at the difference of what happens with the same rainfall in the same field. Actually, if you harvested that and just took the triticale out of there, you'd probably have enough to make a return on that. But there's all of that biomass, all of that carbon that now can be returned to the soil and build that soil health, or it could become cattle feed, either way. So when you inoculate, we can supersede what fertilizers do. It looks like in most all cropping systems. At Chico and now in multiple states, we have 11 research projects going on, looking at different soils, looking at different crops, inoculating and keeping the cover crops and live roots in the ground 12 months a year. In 5 years, we'll have a lot of carbon data to share and see if we're getting the same kind of results David Johnson got also in New Mexico. It's some of the most encouraging work I could be involved with. I saw it happen in my fields in Africa, and I couldn't explain it. With David Johnson and now with this research, we think we're finding the mechanisms, the way a healthy soil biome works that will make a difference. Currently, we have a major project in Arizona where we're researching this in corn, in a corn system. And if you look in the conventional system on this corn at the very bottom, we see that we lost when we applied this 250 pounds of nitrogen to that field, 256 pounds per acre, that we lost to the environment 126 pounds of nitrogen that either leached into the waterways and contaminated the water system or went as nitrous oxides to the atmosphere, contributing to climate change seriously. When we reduced that to only 15% nitrogen and added the biology, we actually created 80 pounds of nitrogen. And where we had in the far right, what we call BEAM, the biologically enhanced system, we created 107 pounds. That's in a corn environment. What we see, of course, is that returns economics to the farmer, let alone the earth and the planet begins to profit at the same time as we build a more resilient system. So the farmer there said to me finally, as I had worked with him in Africa and now working with him in Arizona on this project, he finally said, why am I buying fertilizer when I showed him the same kind of corn I was producing in Africa next to his with no fertilizer, but now he's seen it in his own field. We have to be able to demonstrate this to farmers, and we have to be able to show them the economic rationale of why, and we have to make it affordable and available, which we find with this system that you can do in your own backyard to be extremely affordable. My friend and colleague, Howard Buffett had said, it's really not the green revolution we need to be looking at, it's the brown revolution. How do we build the health of the soil? And that can fix climate. As a matter of fact, from the climate, which I'm going to jump to very quickly in the deference to time, as I mentioned, the amount of carbon typically captured either in studies on no-till or on no-till with cover crops are always a half a ton to maybe a ton. Whereas in this biologically enhanced system, it showed after when that soil got robust, after about 3 years, it was capturing 10 tons. And this is what we're trying to replicate in other fields. Actually, Gabe Brown showed the same response in his farm, but it didn't happen until he brought in the multi-species cover crops, and then he began to graze his fields with livestock before planting his cover crops. In other words, the livestock were inoculating that soil just as David Johnson's was inoculating. And it does bring the soil carbon respiration down dramatically. More total carbon is lost, but on a percentage basis, we've increased it by 10 times the soil carbon and reduced respiration rates by 4 times as that soil got more fungal dominant. So we know we can return ecosystems on this planet to those that photosynthesize, therefore capture carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil. We know we can solve hunger issues, particularly with those smallholder farmers that are farming tired and poor soils, by restoring the living biome and the organic matter to the system. And we can actually take our carbon dioxide levels down if this research continues to promote to pre-industrial levels, not just to the 1.5 increase in temperature, but back to where we captured all. We are impassioned to continue this research and work on this as fast as we can. We ask any interested in joining in the research or running their own to please do it. We think the urgency of where we find ourselves, both in climate and in hunger, in droughts, but in soil loss, is so urgent that it's sort of like all players are welcome. We know it's a paradigm change. It looks extremely promising, and where we find ourselves, we think it's not a risk. It's an essential thing. We all begin to try it and see how we can make it function even more effectively. With that, I'd like to close, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to visit with you today and challenge your thinking into this new paradigmatic realm and engage it with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Honestly, that was a great amount of information, and I think I will need to go back and take my time and look at every slide. But you answered a lot of the questions that I had. It's fascinating to see the centrality of the health of the soil in both carbon sequestration and efficiency and productivity, and also well, regeneration, obviously. So we have many questions from the audience, so I'll keep my questions very light, and we can move on to the audience as well. The first question I had was about obviously well, traditional, or what is called often indigenous knowledge. So as I mentioned earlier, smallholder farms, especially in the global south, play a very big role in food security, right? For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, they produce about 80% of the food, right? And their practice often relies on traditional knowledge. But what we've seen lately is that their knowledge and their expectations of when to plant is completely disturbed by the change in climate, and that creates kind of a discrepancy between what they've been doing for generations and what they ought to be doing now. So the question I want to ask is how to support these farmers, how to close this gap, and also about the knowledge. Do you think that the knowledge is actually obsolete, or do you think that it's more relevant than ever now, because of, obviously, as you were talking about crop variety and crop rotation and all? So maybe we can go with Zituni if you want to address this question first.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. The knowledge is absolutely critical. The indigenous, the knowledge of the indigenous people is critical. The one of smallholder farmers as well, because it's the people who know the land, they know the seasons, they know the practices. It's usually is a tradition that people get from generation to generation, and it's kept in that way without having access to the latest technology, etc. But you're right. Now we live in an era where that has been disrupted. The weather event and the sequence of the seasons even has been disrupted. Now we've seen drought in areas we never thought we see drought before, and vice versa, for floods and hurricanes again in areas where we never thought we would have that. Normally people are used to a certain weather at certain time of the year, and they know where to plant, etc. But I think the combination now is key with that traditional knowledge with the technology that can help to provide information, to provide knowledge. And this is used not only in agriculture, is in health as well, particularly in remote areas where people don't have access to that knowledge. And it can make a difference if you just have some information about what's going to happen in the next week, next 2 weeks, in terms of rainfall, in terms of planning for planting. Because if I were a smallholder farmers and I have limited amount of seeds, obviously, that I need to plant, I don't want to lose them to flooding or to drought. So it would be extremely helpful if, in addition to my traditional knowledge, I can benefit from information that can help me plan and help me plant my crops. And there are some just small technologies, and I just mentioned mobile phones, for instance, that many smallholder farmers have access to that, and it's amazing how much difference it makes in having access to the market, to the prices of food, and we are supporting a number of farmers on this. I don't want to mention the big technologies that happening in some places, but smallholder farmers, and most of them, they don't need actually those big technologies. They just need a little bit of information to help them to plan.
Thank you. So that goes back to what you were talking about, digital innovation and bringing the access to information to the farmers. Tim, do you want to also address this question and give us your perspective? You're muted.
I think what we have to remember, of course, is that we have kind of imposed, often in a colonial manner, ideas around agriculture that still destroy soil. We all carry 10,000 years of history of tillage, which destroys soil at the same time. So we have this challenge of changing long tradition, which could all sometimes be called indigenous tradition, which is destructive in the whole framing of a healthy soil. But we also now can go back to what a lot of the indigenous communities knew about, always returning something to the soil. And one of the things that we know is to feed the biology, we need so much of the organic matter produced on that field to stay in that field, to go back into that field to invest for the next season, or to cool the field down, reduce the amount of evaporation, help ensure against droughts. And so this sometimes gets lost, and there needs to be the combination of bringing those factors that the indigenous knowledge knew about with what we're understanding soil structures, soil capacities, percolation, and also this fertility, its self-fertilizing capacities with the biology. And we can explain that in pretty straightforward forms. But farmers are like farmers everywhere. You can have one farmer, and this happens in Africa a lot, I saw it, farmers using cover crops or using interplanting that is being very successful. And the corn can look wonderful in that field, growing with a cowpea as an example. And the next field is not doing that practice. And the change just doesn't happen. So that's where NGOs and FAOs and organizations that can help disseminate and incentivize change, I think, is what's also going to be needed to help people shift into practices that they have created as a habit that can be changed into a more constructive habit for their own well-being.
Fantastic. So again, dissemination of information, but also respecting some of the practices that do address the issues that we have today. My second question was about genetically modified seeds. So often GMO is kind of presented by the giant of the agricultural kind of sector as Monsanto or Syngenta or DuPont as kind of the future, right? You can make them drought resistant, you can make them herbicide resistant, you can make them insect resistant, you can make them anything resistant, right? So given that we already have a history with this, can you please elucidate what are the agricultural but also socioeconomic impacts of such technology, but also talk about maybe conventionally bred drought-resistant seeds, and if you think there's a difference and more of a future for that. So maybe we can go again with Etienne and your opinion on this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know how much answer you can provide to that. But the GM food obviously is already out there. It's being used in many countries and many parts of the world. If we go back to what I was saying about the level of hunger that we're facing today and the challenges that we're facing, as Professor LaSalle said about the soil degradation, not many people realize actually the damage we're doing to the soil, and the fact that we rely on soil to grow our food. You know, whatever practices we can think about, whatever varieties of seeds we can think about or engineer, we need that. I think that the issue of food security, as I said, is much broader, and we need all, you know, the solutions that we can find, obviously, to address that. But I want to, you know, I'm not an expert on GM, and you know, I don't want to comment on that too much, but just want to go back to what I was saying before in terms of the land that we have available to us that we can use to feed everyone. Something I didn't have time to mention, which is, in addition to the way we're growing food and to make it available to everyone and feed the growing population, we also waste a third of the food that we produce for human consumption. It's really immoral when you consider that we have around 700 million people who go hungry every day. So for me, it's not just the issue of GM, really. There are other ways of looking at the issue of security, food security, and trying to address that in terms of efficiency and sustainability. And regenerative agriculture, as Professor Lassalle said, is absolutely key when we think about the future. So sorry, I'm not answering the question directly because I'm not an expert in GM, but I'm just trying to add some aspects to that.
No, I understand. I mean, also looking at the other elements is important. So maybe, Tim, if you want to give your view on this.
Yes, sure. So genetically modified seed it's like a technology. Let's go and fix this one problem or that one problem, but it becomes very specific to that one crop or that one disease or that one drought condition. And that's a misappropriation of resources, I would posit, from the standpoint that if we invest in the soil, we fix most everything else. So if you want a drought resistant gene, what if you had a drought resistant soil? Then it doesn't matter what seed you're putting in there. What if you have that mulched and it's drought resistant so that you're not worrying about, did I buy the seed? Can I afford to buy the seed, as an example? The second point is let's say insect resistance. When you get a really healthy biological soil, you watch the Brix level of the plants, the sugars and the proteins change in the plant structure, and it becomes distasteful to insects. And Chubasseau in France years ago showed us that. And now more research, Jonathan Lundgren out of Minnesota is showing us that you can actually chase the insects out of your field by having a very healthy biome in that soil and making them more resistant to the insects. They'll go find a plant that's been fertilized because it's weaker than the plant that's worked with the biology in the system. So I always remember these researchers in South Africa. They actually came from an American university, and where Howard Buffett had his big research farm, and they would come to my fields, I think scratching their heads, but I would go look at their research. They were researching root architecture, and the deep roots would chase after that nitrogen that wasn't very present, and the shallow fibrous roots would go sideways looking for the phosphorus, and they were trying to breed plants that could do both of these. And I just scratched my head and said, why don't we get the biology healthy and the soil healthy and don't worry about all of this? And that's a lot of expense and money and detail that we don't have to worry about when we invest in the soils. And for those people that are on tired and poor soils, we can fix their problems tomorrow with building that health and resiliency in that system. The other thing I just offer is to say, this invests not just in food and climate, but it invests in the future of water, because we improve the water cycle. And your streams are not fed then by runoff, they're fed by a percolation and a moving through the springs, and everything gets restored in a sustainable way, not in a flashing, flooding kind of way. So this is way nature created a system that was complex, that was very biodiverse, and that was very healthy. And let's reinvest in that. And I think we don't need to have a GMO conversation. It just doesn't have a space in a very healthy, resilient system.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about this way. I suppose kind of investing in green water instead of investing in modifying genes. Yeah. I have many other questions, but I'll keep it to this last one. It has to do with what you were saying, Zitani, about the fact that about 70% of the agricultural land that we use goes for that we have goes for livestock feed. So in the past years, there has been a growing awareness, especially in the northern hemisphere, about the impact of meat on the environment, especially ruminant livestock, right, because of methane. And vegan and vegetarian organizations have moved a bit from ethical considerations or health considerations and have really emphasized the environmental one, right? And the argument goes a little bit like, this is not efficient, let's stop feeding our food to livestock and instead to humans. So do you think that this position has merit, and if so, in what way? Yeah. If
Yeah, well, we've seen this movement recently. It's not just recently; it's been going on for a while. But in some countries recently, we have seen more movement towards veganism and vegetarianism as well. I think the issue about meat consumption is that, you know, if you look at the whole agricultural sector, as I said earlier, it is a sector which is not efficient. It is a sector that, you know, has a huge potential, of course, to become efficient in the use of natural resources that I mentioned. There's also in the use of energy. But also we need to look at our consumption patterns as well. You know, how we grow the food, how we distribute it, how we use it, and how we're wasting it. So I think the meat consumption is not just one issue, and it's not something we can look at in isolation. Is the whole system that we call it, you know, the food system. It's from the time it's grown on the field, from the time it reaches us as consumers, and then what we do with it, that we have to address all these stages. Really, you know, they are all important. I don't think it would be realistic, obviously, to expect everyone to give up eating meat. I don't think it's realistic. You know, there are other countries, you know, some parts of the world where the standard of living is increasing, and they want to have access to some food that they didn't have before. I think the main issue I want to finish with is that we need to think about a diet that is nutritious, and at the same time a diet that is good for the environment. That's the key thing, you know, and we're all responsible for that. How we purchase our food, what we do with it, how we connect with the land, you know, how much respect we have for food. All these things, we have to think about them again. And we need to stop wasting food. As I said, just think about, you know, the 690 million people who go hungry. We have an abundance of food. We have a huge choice of food, and we have food to feed everyone. So we just need to think about a way of making it accessible and affordable to everyone. So for me, this is the main issue, is not just the meat consumption or other aspects of the food system in isolation. No, it's the whole system.
Fantastic. So need of cultural shift and operational efficiency. So Tim, if you want to give us your opinion on this as well.
Since we're talking with Oxford students, we can discern, right? So we have the ability, and I want to offer this into this conversation and what was just mentioned, which I really, we have 500 million hectares of arable farmed land, and we have about 3 or 3.5 billion hectares of grazed land. But so much of our arable farmland is producing corn and soybeans going into livestock. And that is being done in a degrading way, and it's creating a lot of methane in feedlots and waste and pollutants in feedlot systems. We're actually cutting forests to graze more cattle, and that's emitting more greenhouse gases, and that's a problem. So are we eating too much meat? Likely we are, for what the globe can actually hold. But the way we're doing it from the standpoint of feedlots is much more damaging. If we have well-grazed lands, and what I mean by that, and I would offer people to go and watch a film done by a friend of mine, Peter Bick, called, it's a very short one on Vimeo, called Carbon Cowboys, look at grazing in a very, very healthy way where you can capture carbon and increase biodiversity and greatly reduce methane. And the reason is that if you would go into one of the biggest methane producers on the planet, which are termites, soil termites that eat the organic matter and emit methane, and you put a methane reader down that hole, it's lower than the outside atmosphere. And why is that so? The reason it is so is because there's methanotropic bacteria who consume methane. And in a well-grazed system, the healthy soil has methanotropic bacteria, which help consume the ruminants' methane. So in well-grazed systems, which means meat would not be necessarily an everyday thing for every person on the planet, but it could be part of people's diets if they choose to eat it, and milk and eggs and even swine, which I've seen grazed in situations like this, could be possible if that's part of someone's diet or culture or interest. But it has to be done in an ecologically appropriate manner, in a well-managed, educated approach. And all systems can improve when done that way.
Fantastic. This is why I like doing this talk. I will go and watch the documentary and research more. I will just move to the questions from the audience. So we'll come with one very short question. So when and why did people start tilling? I suppose, yeah, if you want to talk about this, Jim.
Well, I actually, Doctor, you may be an expert on this, but 10,000 years ago is what I know in the research. I don't remember being around then, but I do remember that when we look a lot of the anthropological conversations, there's a lot of discussion around as they started to be able to understand how to cultivate. What you find is in planting, you start to till it up a little bit. There was a sense too that some crops responded because soil maybe was a little compacted, they thought, or whatever. But we know we stimulate certain organisms which release part of that carbon and nitrogen to the plant when we till, but that eventually degrades and disappears. So that's why we have to change it back into a no-till where we're feeding the organisms and letting them build the system back. So they would have seen a response, and it just became a habit and a practice. But it destroyed civilizations. It destroyed Rome. It destroyed Greece. They had to go farther and farther for their food as their soils washed away. The Babylonian region, all of their soils pretty well disappeared. If you look at the Fertile Crescent up in Turkey, if you've ever been there, it's rocks and stones these days. What happened to that deep soil? It blew away. It's gone.
Okay. Do you want to contribute as well, Zituni?
No, I think that was a comprehensive answer. I prefer to move to the next question.
Let's do that. I have a question actually for you directly. One about the consumer side of the equation. So the viewer asked, a lot of the hotspots for risk lie on the consumer side of the equation. What kind of policy instruments are and should be employed to mitigate this risk?
Well, as I said, the consumers, us, we all have a very important role to play in this, because we do shape actually the demand for food that is available to us. As long as there is a demand, for food, then it will be available to us. And that's why I was saying earlier, we have to be careful as to what we purchase and where we purchase it from, and think about, where is it coming from, how it was grown, is it healthy for us and for the environment? So the risk, we're all responsible for looking at that. The risks to the planet, that growing food is not simple, but we have to think about what we ask for, what we want. In many parts of the world, for instance, we want food to be available to us, all the time during all seasons, and that's not sustainable. Because I remember when I was little, I grew up in Morocco, and it was exciting actually to see food available, at some parts of the year, and suddenly you realize, oh, pomegranate, they're out now, and it's very exciting, but you don't find them all year round. And that's the way it has to be. You go to the market and suddenly you discover, oh, there is a food or a vegetable now out that you can have certain recipes and enjoy them with the family. And I think that's the thing we have to think about. We can't just be fussy and think, we want strawberries all year round. and you want avocados all year round, what damage that has on the environment. So the point I want to make, and I was making earlier, is that our choices matter. They matter a lot to the impact that we have on our health and the health of the environment. And we have to rethink that. You know, as Professor Lassalle, we have said, we have to rethink, you know, the soil, and we have to rethink the way we farm. We also have to rethink as people, you know, our connection with food and what we think of food generally. Do we take things for granted? I think in many places of the world we do. And we have to change that. We have to change our attitude and look at food differently. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic gave us a glimpse of that, where initially, if you notice, you know, there was queuing in the supermarkets and some food not available. And this also shows really the vulnerability of the big food system chain we have, that as soon as you have disruption like this, then those chains break and suddenly you don't have access to all the food. So that's why you need to think about, you know, smaller chains, particularly local food, where you can have easy access, and you also obviously support, you know, the development of rural areas and particularly smallholder farmers.
Fantastic. I have to say on a side note that watermelon has to be the highlight of my summer. So this is a question for Professor Lassalle. So will Professor Lassalle share more on the impacts of monoculture and high chemical application on the state of soil health? I believe this way of farming is particularly rampant across the US and Canada.
It is rampant. It's rampant lots of places of the world. It became the idea around modern industrialized agriculture. It's what the Green Revolution sold to India as an idea that's a wheat, a monoculture crop in a system. And what happened to those soils? They got destroyed in so many places, like in the Punjab. They've just been ruined by that system, by that monoculture, high input fertilizer-based system. And so that's the problem of where we've got to step back and think in terms of, even if we go in with a either a monoculture or a semi-monoculture crop, if we have the water in the seasons or a too rainy season environment where we can get other crops or cover crops planted in between and increase the biodiversity of the system, help creating the self-fertilization of the system, then we can wean ourselves quickly from the fertilizer. But the biodiversity of the plant species you have above ground will be matched by the biodiversity below ground. You'll get more organisms, more healthy organisms functioning well. It's the same as in your gut biome. If all you ate was rice and that's all you ate, would you be healthy? It's not just a lack of specific nutrients you're not getting. You'd end up with a very narrow band in your gut biome, and your immunity and human health would drop dramatically. And you'd have to go on IV injections to stay alive, which we've done to our fields. We've gone to these IV injections, our drug addiction of NPK fertilizers, which it's because we're trying to maintain those plants to keep them alive as we've killed the biome of the soil. So it can be returned.
Thank you so much. One more question about policy, let's say. To what extent are unfair trade agreements between African countries, and particularly China and the Middle East, impacting the state of food and financial insecurity in Africa? If you want to answer, provide an answer to this, Zichuni.
The issue with trade, yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of, because trade obviously is around providing food to meet demands, you know, to put it simply. And trade is made around, you know, food commodities that are needed from one part of the world to another, from country to another. And there are trades agreements, obviously, between different countries that, you know, they have to respect certain standards. But here, you know, I want to highlight another issue in relation to trade, particularly in what we see in supermarkets or food imported from the different countries, particularly in the West, where we've seen this trend of wanting certain standards of food. So food has to be of a certain dimension, of a certain color, and you see some of the food like apples or pears and others that almost waxed because that's what the consumer apparently wants, and they have to be displayed in a certain form. And in terms of trade, you can only sell your products, I'm talking particularly for farmers, if they meet those standards. You know, if the apple is not of a certain size and a certain color, and goes the same for tomatoes and carrots, etc., then they won't be accepted. To the extent that here again we see a lot of food loss and waste because of farmers not being able to meet those standards, and therefore what would they do with the food? In some cases they might be able to sell it locally, but again, because of the trade, in many cases you can't, because that food is only destined for particular countries, and you see farmers actually throwing that food away. So trade, I think that it has to look at it again now with a view for sustainability. And trade, again, the aspect I want to highlight. I mean, we don't have much time. There's so many things to talk about trade, but you know, how we make also food available to the consumers, and why do we have to wrap bananas in plastic, for instance? There's some food that, you know, I don't get what kind of standards that says, you know, bananas have to be wrapped in plastic. And you see that in supermarkets. And here again, as consumers, I think we have again to look at our choices, at our demands, and in many countries actually consumers have been powerful actually in turning around the availability of some food because they contain, you know, certain products, or they were displayed in a certain way. So I think we have to look into this, and trade has to consider these socio-economical aspects as well.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive answer. Another question for Tim. So actually two questions that I'll put together. In terms of soil carbon drawdown, does the benefit plateau when the soil has regained the carbon it lost, or does it continue to reduce atmospheric carbon? And is the yield increase in regenerative agriculture demonstrated consistently across different environments? And if so, why is the uptake of this practice so patchy?
Why is it so what? Why is the uptake so what?
So patchy. Only in some areas and not others.
Okay, sure. First of all, let me answer that latter part, and that is that we think it's going to be applicable to all soils because most all soils have had their biomes restricted or damaged. So we think we're going to see responses in all soils. And it's a matter of let's all try it. Let's get out and try it. And the productivity should come. Now I got to ask you to go back to the first question. Sorry, Safa, what was that first question? It was about yield. It was about climate.
So in terms of soil carbon drawdown, does the benefit plateau when the soil has...
Good, perfect. Thank you, got it. So here's the thing that we always get into carbon soil sequestration plateauing. There's always, well, when it gets back to its equilibrium, it plateaus. Go back to the slide where I said we increased soil carbon in the soil by 10 times, and however, the respiration was cut by 4 times. So we started to keep more and more and more, which means we'll go farther than what previous research has talked about. But also you have to think in terms of another idea that carbon plateauing in soil doesn't deal with, and let's deal with this. You know what Charles Darwin's most famous book was? Most best-selling book, I should say, his best-selling book? It wasn't on evolution. It was on earthworms. And why was it on earthworms? Because when he traveled, he found that the little stones that were sitting on top of his paddocks, when he came back, disappeared. Where did they go? They got buried by the earthworms. So we can build more soil, which means we're increasing total capacity of how much carbon can be down here versus up there. And the other part is, as we grow more diverse root systems, and if our summer cover crops, as an example, have sunflowers with these huge, massive root systems, and maybe tap-rooted dichondra radishes and short-rooted things, we're going to deepen that soil and start to make soil in the bedrock. It's going to dissolve it, demineralize it. So we'll deepen it and grow it at the top. So not only can we capture more than we thought was equilibrium just by improving photosynthesis efficiency and soil respiration loss, we can grow soil both directions. So that's not a question of concern now, I would posit. Let's get busy at capturing it, and let's get busy at making healthier soils. There's so much opportunity out there yet.
Fantastic. One question about public-private partnerships. So what role can public-private partnerships play towards sustainable food systems, and how can these partnerships be built in developing countries?
Well, public-private partnership absolutely critical, because the food systems, they involve a wide range of stakeholders, from farmers to entrepreneurs, retailers, etc. So you have a wide range of public-private partnership that's been set up to address various aspects of the food system. And increasingly, we've seen partnerships, dealing with investment in, low carbon options, and also in energy efficiency, particularly for the food supply, and support of farmers, particularly in remote areas, also promoting the use of renewable energy so that farmers can store food and can have access to energy. But lately, what I mentioned about the issues of food loss and waste, we've seen other partnerships being developed, particularly between supermarkets and charities, in trying to address the problem of food loss and waste. In countries such as France and Italy and others, they made that law actually to ban supermarkets from throwing food away. And therefore, they made alliances with charities so that food goes to charities and they will distribute it to people who need it and avoid the issue of food loss and waste. And these partnerships, they're innovative. These are the kind of partnerships we need. You don't only need partnerships about spending money and developing tools and technologies, which are important, but we shouldn't neglect partnerships that. Then I can give you other examples, but just for the sake of time, I just wanted to cite this one, that you have a specific problem that is worldwide, and then you have a partnership between private sector and NGOs, in this case charities, to address the problem of food loss and waste. And this is the kind of things that we need to have all around the world, really, so that we can stop throwing food away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. I'm really aware of time, so I'll just ask you if you want to provide some final comments on this. And I apologize to all of you whose question I was not able to get to. But if you want to go first, Tim.
Yeah, I want to really highlight some of the things that Dr. Uldada said today, and to remember that we really do need to think very consciously about our food choices and think in terms from a consumer standpoint as to what choices we're making and what impact that's having. And that is really, I think, an important element. We have a lot of global companies coming to us because they're trying to meet a carbon budget they've set for themselves, and they know they can't meet it unless there's a regenerative agriculture that actually captures carbon in their supply chains. Agriculture still remains one of their biggest emitters. And so that's kind of wonderful that it's there. So I would encourage people to push on your supermarkets, to push on your brands, to email them and say, I want food produced regeneratively, or that's carbon neutral, or that's carbon sequestering, and push them to continue, because that's a public sort of private thing. I mean, it's a consumer saying to the company, I don't want food produced the way you provided it to me before, destroying the planet. And so that will help. I'm tired of listening to some of them say, we have a goal by 2050. Well, that doesn't help any of us. It doesn't help you. It needs to be a goal by 2030 or 2025, actually. And that's what we need to be shooting for. So I thank you for your interest, and all you young people out there that are engaging this. This is your world. I'm failing miserably at retirement because I care about you and you need a future. And we need to fix this soil to do that. And it's been a delight to be on this with Dr. Uldada and with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it has been a pleasure being with you as well, Professor Lassan. I'm going to pick up on your point on the goal for the long term 2050. I totally agree. So my message to everyone who's watching us, what is your goal today? You know, what is it that you can do to make a change? Even if it's something very small, don't underestimate that. So think of something that you are doing with regard to food that you can change to help actually what we want to achieve in terms of food security and address the famine and hunger, and also, you know, the food waste that I mentioned earlier. For example, if you're using straws to drink, please stop doing that. Nobody needs straws to drink. And again, it's another subject we can go through in terms of the impact that plastic is having on our planet, on animals, particularly in the seas. And so any little change that you can rethink and see how it can help, that will be really very helpful. Thank you. And thank you again, Sanat, for this opportunity. It has been a pleasure to be on this panel with Professor Lassalle.
Thank you so much, both, for great insights tonight. And thank you for finishing on this very empowering statement. I suppose if we can't impact with our vote, I hope we will, at least with our money. So just giving you some information for next week's event. So next week on Tuesday, 24th at 4 p.m., we will welcome Dr. Fatih Birol from the International Energy Agency, and he will talk on green recovery and global climate policy. It's going to be a great event like today as well, and please join us. And so now I'll stop the live streaming. Take care.